and welcome to One Story, One Voice, your weekly online live show where we discuss one story with one prominent voice. Joining us today from New York is Salil Tripathi, writer, journalist, and chair, PEN International Committee on Writers in Prison. I am Kishalay Bhattacharjee, and this is being brought to you live by the Jindal School of Journalism and Communication. I usually spend a little time talking about my guest. I'm very curious about people's biodata, CVs. But Salil's is a very long one, and I had to shrink it down to one little word, prolific. Salil has been on numerous positions. He has won numerous awards, various publications, national, international. He's been living abroad for a very long time. He's been in Britain for 20 years. He now lives, he's coming to us live from actually New York. It's about 8:30 in the morning, Salil, right now, there.
That's right.
And, but there are two books, of course, which I will mention because we would like to come to those books later at some stage of this discussion. The Colonel Who Would Not Repent, The Bangladesh War and Its Unquiet Legacy, a book that Salil wrote, and I'd like him to tell us of how he landed in Bangladesh to write about it. And his current book, of course, that he's writing on the Gujaratis, which promises to be very interesting. But let's start by wishing everyone Eid Mubarak. It's going to be
Eid Mubarak.
Time zones of the world. And it, you know, why I mention Eid Mubarak, Salil, is it's almost been a year since, you know, when the minutes before the rise of the Eid crescent, a dear journalist friend was shot dead in Srinagar, Shujat Bukhari. We don't know who killed him, except the BJP broke away with the PDP and then imposed president's rule out there. The police accused the Lashkar-e-Taiba, arrested one person that they thought was the prime suspect and closed the case. Now, is impunity one of the biggest challenges that PEN faces when it comes to writing?
No, it's a very, very major challenge for writers and journalists literally everywhere. I mean, it's particularly gruesome when these crimes take place against journalists and writers and when they die. I mean, 3 cases I know of where there is still a lot of impunity. One is in Russia, the Russian Federation, Anna Politkovskaya, who was killed a few years ago. Then in Malta, Daphne Caruana Galizia, she was about to enter her car and it was blown up. And of course, there is Gauri Lankesh's case in India and Shujat Bukhari. So yes, there are cases like this that do take place. Shall we say that the investigation into those cases subsequently tends to be lethargic. Powerful people tend to be involved. In some cases, people do find a few arrests, but doesn't really lead to much. And the climate of injustice does prevail. It's a very major crisis. For human rights defenders in general, I can talk about other human rights defenders, but particularly for journalists and writers, and to use that old cliche, those who speak truth to power.
And you know, the Delhi police on Saturday, that's yesterday, arrested 2 members of Pinjra Tod, a women's student organization. And I saw you tweeting about it a couple of minutes back, actually, in connection to their alleged role in the Citizenship Amendment Act and the sit-in protest in February, and then which after that there have been widespread protests in Northeast Delhi, even before the blood dried on those protests. Of course, the entire world has been locked down. So Devangana Kalita and Natasha Narwal, students of JNU, were picked up from their homes. I know we are discussing writers and not really activists or journalists, and you know, PEN has certain ways of categorizing who they are standing for. But I'm sure you stand in solidarity with anybody who uses the written word or anybody who is persecuted. But do you think, Salil, that during COVID, governments across the world have actually exploited the COVID situation to trample civil liberties because we can no longer mobilize even a token candlelight vigil?
Absolutely. I think that's you hit the nail on the head with that. And that's exactly what seems to be going on, that you have cases where people who have been inconvenient, precisely the kind of people, you know, again, to use a cliche, you know, those who make the comfortable, those who offer comfort to the afflicted, and who afflict the comfortable, as you know, it's been said often. I mean, those activists, those trade union leaders, those journalists, those human rights defenders and activists, this is the best time for governments to go after them, because it's very hard to mobilize protests. It's very hard to even go to a court with a petition saying that, this is something that needs to stop, because you don't know whether the court will hear the case. If it hears, what happens? And this is not peculiar to India. Again, it's a global phenomenon. Just a week ago, Martin Lee and Jimmy Lai were arrested in Hong Kong. And now, of course, China has come up with this draconian law in Hong Kong to deal with civil unrest and, basically fast forwarding the basic law, which was supposed to prevail till 2047. And in fact, it's happening within a quarter century rather than the full 50 years. Hungary has done the same thing. Turkey has been doing the same thing. And there are names being announced of people to be arrested in Bangladesh. That is also similar. And in India, it is no different at all. We had Gautam Navlakha and Anand Teltumde, arrested and taken away not long ago. Now, of course, I know that there are charges against them, and those charges should be examined and investigated and so on. But to what extent is custodial sentencing necessary? That's a legitimate question, given that worldwide people are being released from jail, even those who have been convicted because of the COVID situation. So what is gained other than harassment and intimidation by this arrest is a very legitimate question. The space for civil society activism has been shrinking. And, just as Naomi Klein used to say that there is disaster capitalism, that you have, and I've no problem with capitalism. I think it's a great economic phenomenon. But disaster capitalism is that when something really goes wrong, you bring in structural adjustment programs to make the changes you could not. And I think something similar is happening in the civil and political space, that you have a situation which allows a lot of government which want to curb liberties to act right now. But
Salil, what does the government achieve when they crack down in a situation like this? I mean, it was yesterday when the Indian government decided that anyone above 60 under trial, if they have served 6 months and they're under different categories, if the court allows, they will be granted parole. And out here, they go after people with very not very watertight cases and put them behind bars. And what is the government trying to send? What is the message?
I can't think for the government, because I've never been in one, and nor do I want to be in one. But I would imagine it's one way to tell people who has the power, and a sense of intimidation that, and the whole contract, the social contract, if we were to go back to Rousseau, is always been a consent of the governed. And here it is to say that, you may have citizenship by title, but you are essentially subjects. And I think this is what seems to be happening, that the power equation between the state and the people has been changing for quite some time. And I think it goes back further. It started with September 11 and the kind of laws that came in the US and in other democracies to curb freedoms. And it's part of a grand narrative that there is, just as, in 1989, we all rejoiced with the fall of the Berlin Wall and assumption that now it will be democracy that will be everywhere. And it brought with it other problems. And at the same time, now we are in a situation where there's a backlash against it. And there's a lot of populist, nationalistic fury against those who express dissent.
Well, in the forward to the case list that you wrote, cases 2019 of Penn, you invoked that how we may now realize what writers under arrest in prison really go through, but yet we will not be able to experience it fully of the kind of brutality that they go through. I'd like you to spend a little time explaining that feeling, and also giving the audience what Penn is, because we've been talking about Penn, and a lot of people may not be able to relate to that. What is Penn, and how does a university like ours, where do educators and students, how can we get involved in that?
Yeah, so I think I'm glad you pointed out, because I've been the chair of this committee for 5 years now, and my term ends next year, and it's a term limit, so I won't be doing it again. But each year I write this introduction to this, and every year I pick on a theme. And one of the things that struck me was that here I am not able to go out. A lot of my freedoms are curbed just now. I live in New York, which is the epicenter of COVID. And of course, if I go without a mask now, certain shops won't let me enter and all that. So yes, I have restraints on my freedom, but they're still manageable. I'm still able to go to the grocery store, to the liquor store, to the pharmacy, and even go for a walk in the park. I'm able to do all of that, provided I maintain the social distancing rule. But the writer who's a prisoner cannot do any of that. So it makes me feel, what does it mean being confined to a physical space which is rather narrow? I live in this one-room apartment, so you can see behind me how that looks. But at the same time, I have access to the internet. I can talk to you. I mean, if I'm genuinely a prisoner, of some state, I would not have this access. I would not have access to the books that are behind me. I would not have access to libraries except certain books that I can access to. So I think there are lots of restraint that comes. So at least it allows us to understand. I'm not saying empathize fully, because this is not the same as what a writer goes through. And this is only the condition itself. I mean, we know from the cases of other writers who have no idea if they will ever be able to get out, who have sometimes been tortured. Sometimes their health has suffered. I mean, Liu Xiaobo, the Chinese Nobel laureate, who was also the honorary president of the Independent Center for Chinese Writers, for PEN. And he wrote the famous Charter 08, which was the declaration of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Chinese. And for that, he was taken away in jail, and he was released on medical parole, but he died when he came out, and he got the Nobel Peace Prize. We simply don't know what they go through. I mean, we know the cases like Solzhenitsyn and others in the past who had to actually do hard labor in Gulag. So what a writer actually goes through, we never understand, but at least we are getting a glimpse of it. So what PEN tends to do, PEN does many things, but one of the key areas of its work is basically to defend the freedom to write and defend the freedom to read. So those who wish to write, and they're doing so peacefully, and they're not spreading, inciting violence, let me put it that way, the hate speech doctrine, so long as they're not doing any of that, PEN will defend their right, even if there's a fundamental disagreement with whatever they're saying among a lot of people. So, I mean, we have spoken up, we have members who are Jewish, who are Israeli, and yet we have supported a Palestinian writer who was in jail, Darin Tatur, who was in jail because of a poem she wrote. There was a controversial case of David Irving some years ago, who was denying Holocaust, and he was arrested and he was charged in Europe. And PEN did stand up for him. And the most celebrated case everyone knows of in India is of Salman Rushdie, when the book that he wrote, Satanic Verses, its import was banned in India, and other countries banned the actual novel. We spoke up for him, and we would, unhesitatingly. And same with other people in India that we have spoken about. The cases that involve the subcontinent include writers like Taslima Nasreen. So these are the prominent ones. There are lots of other cases in our list that you will find who are not so prominent. Who have been, so we stand by them. The other thing we do is translation. We promote translation, we encourage, we don't believe that there's only 1, 2, or 3 or 4 major languages in the world. There are many languages, and all of them matter. So there's a translations committee. Another committee is about peace, and this is a legacy of the world wars, that during the World War, it was felt important that writers of countries at conflict, if they meet and talk to each other, that's a good thing, because it promotes the so-called second track of diplomacy, if you want to look at it from a realpolitik perspective. And yes, so writers from countries which are at conflict can talk to you, and they talk about peace. That's the third part. And one of the most important committees we have is called Women Writers Committee, and we had a women's manifesto out, which was basically to say that women have the right to roam freely, women have the right to write, women have the right to be heard, to speak, not to be intimidated, not to be insulted, and not to be subject to threats, not to be subject to threats of sexual violence, and not to be subject to violence per se. All of that is part of the Women Writers Committee, which also is a very active part of it. Those are the 4, and otherwise we express solidarity with writers worldwide.
I interrupt you, Salil, out here, just because since you mentioned about women writers, and it had occurred to me that whether they're in terms of gender division, are women writers persecuted more or harassed more? Is there a count? Do you have that for that?
So the problem, you mentioned our case list, and we have mentioned 212 writers who are, our cases, and last year it was 205. it's very, very hard to come up with statistical evidence of that, because if we were to look at a census of it, you'll probably find that there are more men than women who are in prison, but that's only because those are the cases we know. There are other writers who sometimes are not in jail but are persecuted. Let me give the example of one Bangladeshi woman blogger, and I mean, she's now in a safe country outside Bangladesh, and we were partly responsible for helping her get out of the country. But I remember that, for a long time, this was after the bloggers were being killed, one left after Abhijit Roy and so on. And I remember that she used to write on feminism and criticize religion, both Islam and Hinduism. And when she started doing that, she started receiving threats. And when she went to the police apparently told her two things. One is that, why don't you take a different route to go in and out of your house every day? So rather than offering protection, they were offering this suggestion, which is useful, but it doesn't really keep the guys with the machetes at bay. And secondly, the policeman said, but you're a woman, why don't you write on flowers and cooking and something like that? Why don't you write on all these male subjects? I mean, he didn't use the word male subject, but that's what he was implying. Now, would she be considered as a writer under threat? Yes. Would she be captured by any statistic? The answer is no. So there are lots of threats where women are forced into silence because of trolling and intimidation. We see that on Twitter. I mean, Amnesty International had an excellent report studying the political situation, mainly in UK, looking at the impact that intimidation and threats have had on women politicians. There was a woman who fought to have on the 10-pound note or a 5-pound note, I forget which, Jane Austen's image. I mean, she didn't cast for Jane Austen's image, but she wanted a woman on a currency note. And of course, Britain has the Queen on one side, but on the other side, it's all been men, Darwin and Shakespeare and so on. And just for that, the amount of hatred she received was unprecedented. And so that's one case like that. And there have been several cases like that where, I mean, she persisted and she won in the end. And, Jane Austen did get on a currency note after that, so which is a good thing. But this is the situation that we have. So it's very hard to track down and come up with a number saying that are they more or less. But the fact is that more women face threats of physical and sexual violence than male journalists. That is certainly the case.
PEN has been monitoring persecution on writers, artists for over a century now. Has the world
become a century? Next year is our centenary, sir.
Okay. Has the world become a better place or worse off? My guess is that it's still the same, but tell me I'm wrong.
It's very hard to say better or worse, because you will always find some examples which give you a lot of encouragement, and then suddenly things go bad. I mean, two good examples from Asia are Malaysia and Myanmar. I mean, in 2011 and 12, we were also excited that, Aung San Suu Kyi might be the next head of the state. And, she had herself been in jail. We used to campaign for her freedom. She has written 2 very good books on Burma, as she calls it. And we defended her rights of people like Mathida, and who founded PEN in Myanmar, and Ne Pon Lat, another great writer from Myanmar. We did all of that. And then look where we are. I mean, there were these 2 Reuters reporters who did this brilliant report about killing of Rohingyas in the Arakan state, Rakhine as it is called now. And Walon and Chau Su U, they were the 2 journalists who had been jailed for that. And that happened in her time. Another friend of ours called Sawai, who's a poet, very fine Burmese poet. He's facing prosecution now for defaming the army. I think that's the charge against him. And a very fine poet. He's been to India. And if I'm not mistaken, I mean, I think Ashok Vajpayee's Raza Foundation has helped publish one of his books in India. So you have cases like that. Again, Malaysia, 3 years ago when UMNO lost power, we all thought it's a great time for democracy and freedom. And then, of course, there was this change in government, and now they're going after journalists and activists who are speaking out against the laws which are victimizing and stigmatizing migrant workers over the COVID crisis. And there's a journalist who's who writes for South China Morning Post. She is facing possible prosecution over her writing. So you think that things change and then suddenly they go bad. And there are other countries where we always thought that these things could never happen here. And then those countries start to nosedive. I mean, in 1980s and 90s, who would have thought that Hungary and Slovakia and countries like that would have issues because they were all part of the Berlin Wall falling down and coming and becoming more democratic places. But those are difficult places now.
You know, you've been advocating this issue for several years now, Salil. Which is the story closest to you?
Tough to tell, but I do feel very strongly about the whole Salman Rushdie episode. I mean, and I'll tell you why, because I mean, for people of our generation, I suppose, in a way, Rushdie is a writer who made us believe we could do it in English. You know, we could own the language and write it as if it was our language, which it is. I mean, it is an Indian language. And he did that with Midnight Children. And, you know, I grew up in the same part of Bombay as I call it, and many people will call it, and Rushdie calls it. If we were speaking in Gujarati, I would have happily called it Mumbai. But since we are speaking in English, I'll leave it at that. But Rushdie writes about it, you know, Breach Candy and that area. And he spoke to us in a language that we, and then he was a matter of great pride after he won the Booker Prize. And then a few years later, he writes Satanic Verses, which is completely distorted by people who wanted to interpret it in a particular way by saying that this is an attack on a particular religion, whereas all he was doing was writing about a man losing his mind and hallucinating, thinking that he was a founder of a great religion, and actually satirizing the guy for his, and basically talking about hybridity and what migration does to people. It's one of the critical novels to understand the last century, and probably this one too, especially. And he wrote that. And then to see India being the first country to prevent its wider dissemination was terrible. And I used to work for India Today in those days, and I remember writing both an editorial. We used to have, it was called Comment, page 1, as soon as it was. And I wrote the comment opposing the ban that was announced at that time. It's never signed, so if you go back to it, you won't find my name there, but it's a matter of record that I did write it. And then I wrote a cover story about the fatwa that followed from that. I mean, and I just thought that how could anybody threaten to kill a writer? It just doesn't make sense. And you know, if you don't like a book, shut it, argue with it, write another book, campaign and tell people don't read this book because it's terrible. All of that is fine. That's part of discourse. But to threaten to kill, and actually, you know, or kill, as it has happened with some other writers, you know, Rushdie's Norwegian publisher was attacked by a gunshot wound, and he, Willem Nygard, he has been with PEN Norway for many years. He's been its president in the past, very good friend of mine. The Japanese translator was stabbed and killed. In London, one of the bookstores at that time was threatened with a bomb attack. And since then, it has been going on like that. I mean, it's not unique to just that case. It was a kind of a landmark case for many people coming of age thing. I was in my mid-20s when it happened. But yeah, I mean, that story has stayed with me. And every time I say that, look, this happened and we spoke out against it, and that's why people feel it is wrong. And we must continue to do that every time another writer is attacked, wherever it might be. And
I'll take this opportunity at this point of the show to request the listeners, the viewers, to please start asking questions, because in about 10 minutes we will take questions, and you know, there is our team which will be passing on the questions to us, and Salil and I will try and answer your questions. So please start typing in your questions. And Salil, to come back to the discussion, when we decided to call this program or episode "Writers in Prison," I was going through two of my very dear books that I have been carrying for a very long time. One is Kosinski's The Painted Bird, and the other, of course, is the Letters and Writings of Boris Pasternak. And you know, if I refer to or invoke Kosinski, often reminded that how the families and the near and dear ones of writers in exile or writers are in prison are actually so persecuted, harassed, intimidated all their lives. And Kosinski, you know, father died, he could not even go and attend the funeral. His mother had to move from one hiding place to another hiding place. And the same is, of course, for so many other writers. And they're very well-known writers. So we are not even talking about, you know, writers who do not have the support. These are writers who had great international support, but you know, could not return home, or their families were persecuted. Does PEN or other organizations also stand in solidarity or support families?
Well, yes. I mean, there is a small fund we do have, which is not. I wish it were generous. It can't be because it's a small fund and it's through contribution, voluntary contribution, which does sometimes offer financial support to the family, and yeah, which may be not a large amount at all, but it probably can go very long way in certain countries. PEN also helps out the relocation of a writer and a family if it becomes necessary from a place where they are under threat. I mean, I don't want to claim we do more than we do. There are other organizations also which do brilliantly, and there is an organization called ICORN, I should mention here, which is ICORN, International Cities of Refuge Network. And what they do is that they identify, there are about 60 cities in the world which say that we will give sanctuary to a writer who is facing risk. And most of them are in Europe, Northern Europe. Scandinavia has a lot of them. And there are Bangladeshi bloggers who are safe and free today because they live in those cities. And what PEN does, it works very closely with ICON in identifying and verifying the claims. And so that, it becomes an informed decision, so that when we make an appeal or ICON makes an appeal to a particular city mayor, then it's based on solid evidence and grounding, that it's not somebody who wants to migrate out of the country for economic or any other reason, but it's basically because of the persecution. These are temporary residences ranging between 6 months to 2 years, but very often the writers want to go back, very often they don't want to go back, and they're able to find other ways of staying there. So that's another thing that PEN tends to do, but I don't want to have to be realistic, that we don't want to raise expectations that we have, because we are a bunch of writers who feel strongly about this, and we can only have a moral appeal and appeal on the grounds of facts and human rights, that this ultimately these decisions are sovereign decisions made by governments, and it's not an easy time. I mean, COVID apart, but even other than that, with the refugee crisis and the perception that there are too many foreigners coming into the country, given all of that has been going on in certain countries, there has been a certain amount of backlash too. So it's not easy. I mean, there are writers who ask us, and it takes a long time before the government agrees, and writers get frustrated, but there's only so much we can do. But there's that, and there is a fun, and the otherwise there's a lot of vigils that we have. We attend trials. If there's a writer facing a trial, and in Turkey we have done that a lot, because Turkey has a unique and dubious distinction just now of jailing one of the largest number of writers and journalists in the world. Cumhuriyet newspaper, and some writers are in exile, and Asıl Erdogan and Ahmad Altan, and I can keep telling you names of writers who have faced persecution in Turkey. And so our members who feel very strongly about it, sometimes using their own resources, go to attend the trial to bear witness. That's another thing we do, which is a great comfort level for those who love and care for those writers. So yeah.
And, I also think of Boris Pasternak's case, and, using that as a reference. It's been the writers' union in many of the countries which actually cracked down upon writing and the writers. So, in your experience, do you also find writers on two sides of the divide? I mean, they are not always one. So how do you?
No, of course they are not always one, and of course it's not an easy argument. I mean, you would find cases where there's a writer who holds an unpopular view, which may be about, a Chinese writer today saying that, Tibet should be independent, for example, or, the persecution of Uyghurs in Western China, Xinjiang region should end. Maybe the official Chinese union will crack down on that writer and, say that she should stop writing and, support the arrest that might take place. And so all of that might very well happen. That kind of nationalistic fervor. I mean, when the writers returned their honors, the Sahitya Academy and other honors in India after the killings of Kalburgi and Dabholkar and Pansare, by and large, I mean, people were not, there was a criticism of that from some journalists, some television anchors were calling them Award Wapsi gang and all of that. I mean, one would imagine that journalists would not join in this kind of witch hunt against those writers, but it did happen. So you're absolutely right that there are writers who fall on the different sides of a divide, and some issues are contentious. And in a way, that's not such a wrong thing, because it would be terrible if all writers had only one view. I mean, the diversity of opinion is always good. those should be always get resolved through debate and conversations, and not by the law and not by intimidation, and certainly not by violence.
Laws on free speech or such draconian laws, particularly in India, and I'm sure the same with various other post-colonial world, goes back, to 1860s, goes back to way back. How is it that nobody has been able to challenge and do away with these acts and laws? How is it that we continue to live with these archaic laws? Where is the collective mobilization that we are talking about? Here you're saying that in Penn, for example, that hundreds of very influential people, Nobel laureates, and all kinds of other people who are there and standing in solidarity. Is it believable that we still have to continue with such laws without anyone challenging them?
No, I entirely agree with you. But I think what tends to happen, and if you go back to, again, I think it's a line in Midnight's Children, where he says that on the midnight of 14th August, 15th August, 1947, a lot of brown people overnight turned white, is what it says. And, it's a very colorful and metaphoric way of saying exactly what happened, that people who were freedom fighters, once they got power, started restricting the very freedoms that they had fought for because they didn't want others to get those freedoms. And this is, again, not peculiar to India. I've seen it in Senegal, for example, where there was a freedom fighter who was in jail. He became the president, and then he almost refused to leave. And it became he had 2 terms and he stood for the 3rd, and it became fairly tragic, the end after that. What we know about Aung San Suu Kyi is another example like that. So just because somebody is a victim and then becomes someone in power doesn't necessarily mean that they will bear in mind the interests of other victims, and they will probably use the same laws that are at their disposal to continue to intimidate. And it goes back to the citizen versus subject the argument that people have, about when they're talking about what is the role of an individual in a society. That, so long as they are not seen as citizens, so long as rights are seen as privileges granted to people, this problem accentuates even further. And I think that probably is at the heart of it, that there's a lot of reluctance among a lot of people once they are in power to talk about, and this is not party political at all. In India, for example, the Congress party might say we are all for free speech, but its own record of banning books and, persecuting writers is hardly something to be proud of. And of course, it's been in power much longer, so more writers have faced threats and intimidation in its rule than what we find otherwise. But the others are doing no better. The current government says that we are all victims of emergency, but then they're acting in ways that doesn't make that makes you wonder that did they learn anything from what they had gone through at that time? So this is a perpetual battle between those with power and those who challenge power, and I think that's exactly what's playing out in country after country across the world.
Salil, just to move away before we take the questions to your work in Bangladesh. You first went to Bangladesh in '86 to report out there, and then you, of course, years later ended up writing this book. What is your connection, love with Bangladesh? And is Bangladesh a country where where writers' freedom is also curtailed as much as part of the other parts of the subcontinent?
Definitely. It's sad because, it's a country of Tagore and Nazrullah after all, So, Tagore is ours as in India, but Tagore is also theirs as in Bangladesh. Ours and theirs can be very nebulous terms here. And the reason I invoke Tagore is precisely because of where the mind is without fear and the head is held high, that famous poem that so many of us know by heart. And I have 3 reasons for, why that book happened. One is very personal, which is that, our family is a Banglophile family, if I can use such a phrase. I'm Gujarati, but I chose to study the language. My parents were also very fond of Bengali culture. My dad learned Rabindra Sangeet. My mother read most of the literature. I read most of the Bengali literature as a child in Gujarati first. And then later, of course, I decided to study it because I wanted to see Bengali films without subtitles. And so I studied it for 2 years. I can read it slowly. I can write it even more slowly, but I can understand it reasonably well. So that's the personal part. The second is the war. I was 8 or 9 or 10 maybe when the war started. in 71, yeah, so I was just turning 10. And I have memories of it, putting black sheets on the windows and listening to the home guard saying lights out, and seeing I was in Bombay in those days, so seeing the glares and flares being sent, when the fear that Pakistan Air Force might come and attack Bombay, all of that was there. Making food and taking it for the soldiers at Victoria Terminus Station, as it was the Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus was called in those days, because soldiers were going and we were bringing food for them. So all of that, and the refugee crisis, I mean, that was a very vivid part of it. So there was that personal connection. And the third is I've been working in human rights now for several years, and the whole idea of impunity, that if you commit a war crime or crime against humanity, is there any justice? Is there a quest? And Bangladesh had waited 40-something years for justice. There were people who had killed, Mujibur Rahman, and who were allowed to re-enter the country. One of them even ran for president. And in 1986, the story that you talked about, I was in Bangladesh and I interviewed Colonel Farooq, who was one of those who actually commanded the tanks that went to Mujib's house in Donmandi, and that led to the assassination on August 15, 1975. So that history was very vivid. I loved the culture, and I had an intellectual interest because of my interest in human rights. So all of that came together to write the book. Now, is Bangladesh in a bad place? Yes, the answer is true. I mean, we know of at least 10 or 12 bloggers who have been hacked and killed in the last 3 or 4 years, Abhijit Roy onwards. We also know of others who have been slashed. One of my friends has been slashed, and he's now in Norway and runs a magazine called Shuddha, which is basically the pure sound. I suppose Shuddha is what it means. And Tutul, we call him, Amadur Rashid Tutul, and he runs that magazine from there. I've written for it once. And so you have stories like that happening. And then terrible arrest, torture for one night, and persecution of my good friend Shahidul Alam, who was giving a Facebook Live interview. I mean, he was just doing a conversation like we are having, but he was speaking to, I think, about what was going on, and then gave an interview to Al Jazeera, and that was sufficient for them, that under the Misuse of Technology Act, taken away, beaten up on the first day, 100 and something days in jail. I mean, we collective effort to get him out, and we are very lucky he's out, but the charges aren't dropped yet. So to say that, Bangladesh is doing well, I mean, it's a statement of faith rather than to say it's a statement based on reality.
And, I was curious looking at your story of your life, of how you got a degree in commerce. So it was basically, I think the only Gujarati thing that you did was to study business. And so how did that shift happen from learning Bengali and then, moving to business and then coming back to where you are? I mean, where you are a prolific writer. And of course, where you wear several other hats, but where did that business fit in?
So I mean, we are all obedient sons of our parents, right? In a sense. So my parents were keen that whatever I do in life, I should have a proper degree, because if things go wrong, I can always fall back on the degree. So they were very keen that, I mean, become a lawyer or something. So, but I mean, anyway, I do like economics a lot. I mean, I don't write much on economics now, but for several years, I was a regional economics correspondent for Far Eastern Economic Review in Singapore and Hong Kong, and covered the Asian crisis and currency movements and so on. And so I did my master's in international economics. And there was a time when I did think of working with the World Bank. This was back in mid-80s when I just graduated from a fine business school in the US. And I thought I would do that, but I also loved writing. And I still remember that, it's like that Robert Frost poem, two roads diverged in the wood, and I took the one less traveled by. What happened in my case was I was back in India and I had 2 job offers. One was with Citibank to be a vice president, like everybody who with an MBA joining Citibank in those days became a vice president. And the other option was that Nihal Singh was setting up Indian Post. And Nihal Singh wanted me to write, and he said he would like me to join. And I said, what would I do? He said, well, you can run the op-ed page and work with me and learn from, he didn't say learn from me, I learned a lot from him, but to set up the op-ed page and write whatever you want. So between being hawking credit cards to consumers at Citibank versus writing for Nihal Singh. It seemed like that's right choice, and the salary in those days was similar. So my mom said, yeah, okay, that makes sense. You're getting the same amount of money. Of course, the extrapolations were different completely. So, I mean, my curve remained flat. That one just exponentially would have risen, and yeah. But that's how it turned out. Yeah.
All right, Salil, let's take some questions. There's Amit Lahiri. I'm presuming that he is one of my colleagues from he's an environment person. So his question is, truth to power is often a great phrase for rhetoric. What would you advise, especially to young people who still have the fire of recklessness burning, how to nurture the inconvenience of truth?
That's a profound question. I think the speaking truth to power is a good starting point to have, but also to recognize that truth is not exactly correct. Pontius Pilate, I go back to that. It varies, and so be constantly in constant search for truth, and especially when there are issues which have differing opinions. And if it's an environmental issue, it's a very interesting one, about people versus planet. I mean, that does become an issue. It's very easy to say that stop coal altogether tomorrow because it's polluting the environment, but it might be the cheapest source of fuel for people. So speaking truth to power would mean stop coal mines, but I would probably say that yes, but then also uphold the rights for either other natural forms of cleaner fuels, or make it possible for people who are really poor to access fuel which is inexpensive for cooking, and in cold countries, for heating. And unless that is done, then it becomes a very convenient form of truth, which is only suitable. It's a bit like, the Western world telling India not to have cars, but instead of public transport and use bicycles, which is great as an idea. But I mean, the inhuman conditions in which people travel in public transport, or, family of 5 on a little motor scooter is itself a degradation. I'm not saying it's a human rights violation, but it degrades human dignity. So unless there are solutions there, truth itself is a fairly complex idea. So approach that truth humbly is what I would say, rather than say that I know it and it's like, not have a religious fervor around truth, because there are too many people who are religious who say they have the truth, and that's a problem.
There's Nikhil Bhatia, and he says that how much did the stories of Bangladesh war I'm not getting the word, but or whatever books inspire you? How much did the stories of the Bangladesh war inspire you? I suppose that's the question.
Oh, okay. No, I think it did. It was extremely inspiring. I mean, in the sense that when I went in 1986, I hadn't read anything when I went there. And when I went in 2011 onwards, when I was researching the Bangladesh book, of course, there were the stories of Manekshaw and General Jacob and all of that at the back of my mind, which I hadn't read per se. But just by listening to the real stories of people through the archives, the oral history archives at the Mukti Jodha Jadugar is really worth listening to, and meeting people who had lived through that experience and their stories. And then the couple of other books that were helpful. One was Gary Bass's book, The Blood Telegram, which is itself based on Archer Blood, who was the ambassador in Dhaka at the time of the war, and his biography, autobiography. And Srinath Raghavan's book on 1971, which places the conflict in a very good context, explaining the geopolitics around it. I learned a lot from those books as I approached them, and also the other books which were controversial and challenging, which made me question some of the things I was hearing, because victims tend to exaggerate what they're saying. So you want to actually push, and try to find out, again, where the truth is, rather than accept it as gospel.
There's, related to the previous question on for truth to power is a question by R. Sudarshan. I'm guessing he's my senior colleague, the Dean of the School of Governance and Public Policy at Jindal Global University. And Professor Sudarshan asks, doesn't power already know the truth? Should we not speak the truth about power? Yes, I know, because Professor Sudarshan always insists on this. It is not about truth, but truth about power.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, the fact that power has to be an instrument of good, ultimately, at least in democracies, power is entrusted to the people who have temporarily, right? I mean, they're supposed to use it for some time to either meet the expectations of the people or meet the promises that they have made. And when they fail, it's the duty of human rights defenders, for lawyers, for advocates, for civil society activists, and journalists and writers to say that, look, this is the reason you have the power, and use it, and how are you going to use it? And again, the power of empathy becomes very important. And when it is not being done, to say so, that, you have the power and you're choosing not to exercise it in the right way, and you're actually entrenching those who are already benefiting rather than those who need the help. I mean, and everyone keeps quoting that talisman of Gandhi all the time, but it's rings through every time that, whenever you are thinking of any step to take, think of the impact on the poorest and the weakest, and see how you can improve that condition. If you can't do that, and it applies in every society. I mean, even in New York City, I would say the same, that, the homeless woman, how is she affected by the COVID crisis? Think of that rather than, whether you have the state-of-the-art testing equipment and so on. I mean, that's good to have, but I think you have to think of and I think speaking like that and say the limits of the power on one hand, and B, where it is not being used right, that becomes the duty of vigilant citizenry.
This Sanjay Hazarika, who says, hi, Salil and Kishalay, journalists are not just in jail, but losing their jobs as well. Yeah. When you can't mobilize or assemble, how do you bring virtual pressure on governments and corporates? And journalists are being arrested in India and Bangladesh and being sacked. And I'm glad you're part of Samden. Yeah, I mean, what can we do? I mean, we can't go to Jantar Mantar, not that Jantar Mantar candle vigil really helps, but, we can't be on online platforms and mobilizing. Will that help? I mean, what is a road map that you have, or, internationally able to build pressure?
No, I think the question Sanjay raises, and he's a very, very old good friend of mine. We go back to 1980s again. So wonderful to hear from you, Sanjay. But I think the question he raises is a profound one about the economics of media today. I mean, the fact is that, the day media companies decided to give away the store by making their content available for free, the problem started, because when the advertising vanished from their mediums to other mediums, they had literally nothing to fall back on, because people were used to getting media for free. And there is still no way. I mean, everyone shares original reporting from newspapers on Facebook and Twitter and all of that. And Facebook and Twitter pay nothing to those news organizations. Just imagine if every story you share on Facebook, and if Twitter, I mean, there's a statistic that says that each customer's data is worth $50 for Facebook, ultimately. I mean, right? Think of, extrapolate over the 2 billion people they have, and you'd realize what is their revenue. So if out of the $50, if $10 per medium, I mean, was sent back to cost of royalties, that would be good. But in its absence, a crisis like COVID becomes an opportunity for bottom line driven publishers and corporations to, try to streamline. And I think the way around it would be for, subscription-based models. More and more people will have to start moving in that direction by agreeing and be willing to pay. I mean, the number of times I hear, even among journalist circles, if I post a story, let's say from Financial Times or Wall Street Journal or even Business Standard for people to read, they say, oh, it's behind a paywall. Can you send me the PDF? No, it's like $2 or 100 rupees or 5 rupees, whatever it is. Why can't we pay for it? I mean, if we journalists don't pay for content, why should we expect the readers to pay for it? And I think we have to value our own work, and we have to think of alternative means. How Wire and Scroll are trying to get readers to support, because advertising may or may not come back. I mean, particularly after COVID. But we have to think of ways in which we can harness some of that revenue, because relying on the state for benefits is not a good idea at all, because then you create another kind of patronage, which is not at all nice.
There's another question by Ashima, who asks, we conceive social media as a space where anyone can share their opinion, but even that space has been targeted by putting people behind bars for 30, 40 days. These people may not even be writers or journalists, but people who merely choose to share their views with the written word. Why are these people perceived as threat?
I wish I knew. I mean, that's a very good question, but we've had that, right? And I think in Maharashtra, I remember there was a young woman who had said something about Bal Thackeray's death, saying that, yeah, I think she said that, why is the city closed down for that for so long? And another young woman clicked like on it, and not only were the two arrested for a while, but I think one of them was the daughter of a doctor, and the father's clinic was ransacked by people who went down and did that. And I think it was Mamata Banerjee whose administration arrested somebody for sharing a cartoon, I believe. I mean my facts may not be entirely correct, but so the point of bringing up these cases that this cuts across party line. You know, there's no party which is truly committed to free expression, and there is no religious group which is committed to free expression either. I mean, freedom of speech is for freedom for me to say what I want, but I don't want to listen to you. And if you do speak out, you don't have that right of free speech. I think that's the fundamental problem with what's happening on social. And there's nothing wrong with people shouting at each other on social media. You always have the mute button or block button and so on. But why does the state have to get involved and start either? And I think it's not just the state getting involved, but you were talking about those colonial era laws. India does have laws, and India is not the only one. Singapore has them, Malaysia has them, Kenya has them, which basically allow literally anybody to use a doctrine like sedition or use a doctrine like disrupting communal harmony and go after somebody, saying that, oh, he offended my feelings, and saying becomes a republic of hurt sentiments. All the countries are becoming republics of hurt. And if your sentiments are that sensitive, meditate or do something to feel stronger about it rather than stop others from speaking.
There is, I mean, we are running out of time, but let's take the last two questions because they're already here. Ayushman Sabu is asking, what advice will you give to a business student, since you have been one who wants to move into the field of human rights?
Wonderful, excellent. Please do. I think companies can do with that kind of thinking. I mean, I do work 2.5 days a week with the Institute for Human Rights and Business, where we try to inject corporate accountability. To improve human rights in the corporate setting, you don't have to join a human rights group. You don't have to be part of government either. You could actually be in the company and be the force of change. I mean, I've done a fair amount of work on LGBT rights and business, for example. And I can tell you the number of companies where the change has come from within, by champions within companies, Microsoft, GE, IBM, Deutsche Bank, PayPal. I can go name companies. And in India, it is the Lalit group of hotels and Godrej group, where people have become individual champions in the company to eliminate discrimination. And I think, I mean, the LGBT battle seems to be, India seems to be winning it well, but there's still the battle of gender. There's still the battle of minority representation, and still the matter of Dalits in corporation. And I think more and more people who have the sensitivity to enter the corporate sector and corporate sphere with those views, our workplaces will be better.
Okay, let's take the last question then. Kunj, with the continuing arrests of students, scholars, journalists, and the ongoing lockdown, how does one dissent in a time like this? What should be our next step, specifically with the Citizenship Amendment Bill issue? Yeah, so I suppose.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm not a. What can I? It's a tough one to answer, because how public protests will be allowed in future, I simply don't know. I mean, there's still a lockdown, and in a lockdown, it does make it very hard for people to come together. And I think the people who gathered at Shaheen Bagh were incredibly responsible when they said that, we will move because it might create an issue. And so I think that whenever larger gatherings are being permitted, so long as the gatherings remain peaceful, the critical part is, peacefulness. I mean, the protests and demonstrations have got to be nonviolent and peaceful. So long as that is in place, that is one way forward. Using the courts is another way forward. I mean, especially if gatherings are allowed and certain gatherings are not being allowed. I mean, nobody should lose faith in the judiciary, however difficult it might seem. Use, I mean, online protests have only a limited value, but to make sure that, be part of that universe, so that people, you're not alone. And the last thing that people have in their hands is, of course, the vote. Vote wisely every time. I mean, it doesn't mean which way you want to vote, but at least take an informed decision. And to get people to take that informed decision, requires mobilization, free expression, right to participate. And how to do that is going to be even more difficult and even more controversial, given that everyone might have a phone with an app which can find out where you are going and who you are meeting. And therefore, to keep fighting for that hard-won right of privacy that the Indian Supreme Court granted some years ago.
You know, I will wrap up now, and but before that, I've talked about Kosinski and Boris Pasternak, but I can't wrap up the show without talking about Anna Akhmatova. So, how there have been writers who had the opportunity to leave their country and escape, but like Akhmatova did not do that. And I think in one of her poems, A Dream, which best captures, of course, various, the times that we are living, where she says that we met in an unbelievable year when the world's strength was at ebb. Everything was in mourning, everything withered by adversity, and the only graves were fresh. Without street lights, the Neva's waves were black as pitch. Thick night enclosed me like a wall. That's when my voice called out to you. Why it did, I still don't understand. And you came to me as if guided by a star, that tragic autumn stepping into that irrevocably ruined house from whence had flown a flock of burnt verse. She was talking, of course, of her close association with Isaiah Berlin. And, but I always remember Akhmatova during times like this, times of extreme adversity, particularly with for writers and artists. But thank you so much, Salil. I hope we can continue this conversation. And when I'm saying continue the conversation, not exactly between you and I, which we will do anyways, but between writers in prison committee and students and educators at large. I think we need to have far more, many more conversations to build that solidarity. And thank you so much to my research team of Anjana, Ashima, and Shambhavi, to the IT team, Vidyut, and to the marketing team led by Nagendra. Thank you, Jindal School of Journalism and Communication. Next week, same day, same time, we will be coming back with you and we'll be discussing music next week with Vidya Shah, another friend of Salil, I know. And last week we discussed hunger. This week we are discussing freedom, the writer's freedom, and next week probably the musical freedom we'll be discussing. But we want our listeners, our colleagues to write in, tell us who do you want to listen to, what are the issues that you want to raise to, because we want to create a space where we can, without having, usual talking heads that you have, but have a more meaningful, substantive discussion. Thank you so much. Good night. Good luck. Stay safe.
Thank you so much. Yeah.